more importantly even than his story is his importance, which is really hard to overstate, and we'll get there in a second. Pope St. John Paul II was born Karol Wojtyła, and we're going to be a lot of Polish names, or as few as possible, but sometimes I'm just going to say Polish name because these are unpronounceable, and even if we do know how to pronounce them, it has no correlation at all to what letters are actually used, because Polish, I think, was based on a dare, most of the vocabulary and most of the letter choices. And so Karol Wojtyła, born in Poland in May 1920. That's confusing. May the 18th, 1920. And so we want to start with just a brief word about Poland. Poland is a big, gigantic, old country. It's a country with a pile of Jewish people, a pile of Western Catholics, and a pile of Eastern Catholics, which makes it a deeply confusing place to do anything, because you're not just talking about, say, we've got some Baptists down the road that are a little hard to get along with. You're talking about people who are ancient peoples with profound cultures that are praiseworthy. And you've got folks who are doing the Eastern Orthodox or Eastern Catholic sort of thing and the Western Catholic sort of thing. And then you have the chosen people as the Jews, and you have all these religions which are, just deeply historical and ancient religions that have a lot of truth with them. And they all kind of sort of get along and sort of not. And on top of that, you're dealing with a culture that is ancient, that is at least 1,000 years old, where you're saying, gosh, the founder of our nation was a great Catholic prince, but then we've always kind of had this relationship with the Jewish people and this relationship with our Slavic brethren on the other side, and it makes for a great deal of complexity when you think about the way that John Paul II, or Karol, or little Charlie, grew up and how he was kind of raised. As a child, he is living and kind of playing on the playground down the road from Auschwitz, right? So he's got a certain sense, too, of the darkness of the world in which we live from a young age. And in fact, he even talks about that from a relatively young age. He is still fairly young when Hitler is rising to power, 13, 14, 15 years old. And so these are kind of a great deal of darkness around him. And of course, we remember that the fall of the Russian monarchy, the fall of the czars, is back in the 1914, 1915 range. And so Wojtyła is born into the kind of implosion of modernity, the implosion of the Western world. More to come about that, but that's a gigantic part of his own understanding. And because his father was a deeply well-read man, this is something that Wojtyła would have been hearing lessons about this kind of thing from a young age. You could imagine, we kind of joke about the Trump people nowadays, but you could imagine how people who are very, very young, say 3 and 4 and 5 years old, are right now having their parents tell them stories about how the election was stolen, and true or not is a moot point. This is a big formative way of thinking for these children. Wojtyła was born into the exact same kind of imploding culture and looking around and saying, how do I understand the gross kind of lack of civility, the lack of ability to get along with one another. And so that's something that is deeply formative for him as he is looking around and saying, how do I understand the world I'm in? The Holocaust kinds of things are happening as he's a young man, and those are, the sorts of things that really do strike you when you look around and say, people I grew up on the playground with who are Jews, these people are now illegal. These people have now been deported simply because their religion and culture is a little different than mine. And so you could understand how Wojtyła is born into a deeply disturbing kind of moment in world history. as he kind of grows up in this culture, he is also in a situation where his own religion goes from being, no, we're never going to persecute Christianity, to now we're going to persecute just Catholicism, to now we're going to persecute all sorts of different religious cultures. And so he is at various times in his youth going to be in forced labor camps. As he is trying to study for to be a priest, he's having to do so underground because there are various types of persecutions happening around him. As a young man, he actually gets hit by a truck, which is its own troublesome kind of problem. And so, faces a very real personal experience with near death. And in the midst of all of these things, and again, I'm not trying to cover every piece of his biography. This is, just kind of as an overview. In the midst of all of this, he is also going to find himself as an incredibly talented athlete. He is going to be a really accomplished soccer goalie. He's going to be a very, very accomplished hiker and an accomplished skier, alongside being an extremely talented stage performer, an excellent singer and vocalist, as well as probably the smartest person in every room he ever walked into, ever. He's just an incredible kind of once-in-a-millennium kind of person. And in addition to all of this, he is an incredibly skilled artist, a poet. He publishes plays, he acts in plays, and he's writing kind of these underground sorts of letters and documents and manifestos and plays and poetry and all kinds of unexpected and wonderful things. In addition to all of that, he finds himself naturally talented at math, at politics, and a genuine people person. All of this without being raised with a mother, because his mother dies at a young age. And so you have this remarkable guy. And of course, there are tons of books, lots of ink spilled about every detail of his life, but you have a guy who everybody looks around and says, this cat's got something special. I mean, he's just remarkable at everything. He does manage to be ordained in the midst of all this chaos and immediately becomes the most popular priest in the whole wide world. He's, successful at everything he tries. He is deeply beloved by everybody. And really and truly, he kind of comes up into his own in his mid-20s in the late 40s. And so just as he is now in a position to say, okay, well, we're done with Hitler, and all that stuff in the late 30s and mid-40s, as soon as Hitler's out the window, now we've got to deal with the Soviets who come in, and the Soviets are an entirely separate set of problems. And for Poland, it was never as much a Cold War as it was for us. The war was quite warm in Poland, and there was a lot of violence in the streets and a lot of real problems. And you have Pope St. John Paul II, who at this time is just Father Charlie, or Father Wojtyła, who is working at the university that is called the Jagiellonian University. It's very Polish. But it's this remarkable school where you're talking about these great, brilliant thinkers like Galileo Galilei, kind of associated with these places, and Copernicus associated with this school. He's there, and he's writing, and he's thinking, and he's coming up with all these kinds of brilliant things. And in the early 1950s, he finds himself now as a bishop and then an archbishop of Poland, or of the Bishop of Krakow. He'll later become the Archbishop of Poland. So this is just a super, super simple thumbnail overview to say this guy is beyond brilliant. He is beyond accomplished. He's a once-in-a-lifetime, once-in-a-millennium kind of human being who is just good at everything, quite literally everything. Now, what makes this important, what makes it matter that he's just somebody who happens to be brilliant, isn't that wonderful, is that contrary to what we've often been taught about the modern world, the mid-19th century through the mid-20th century is probably the single most important moment of world history since the decline of the Roman Empire in the 400s. We have to kind of get our heads around the idea. We've been taught that all that really mattered was there were the Romans, there was the Dark Era, then the 60s. And everything from that point on is what matters. But in reality, certainly when it comes to Catholicism and certainly when it comes to Europe, the middle 19th century, the 1850s, 1860s, is when you have Our Lady of Knock. It's when you have Our Lady of La Salette. It's when you have Our Lady of Lourdes. And it's also when we start to have these unbelievable and unexpected things like the complete implosion of the monarchies. I mean, these things have been around, for 1,000 years. A lot of these things are tracing back to Charlemagne. And then suddenly we look up and go, oh goodness, now we have the implosion of the French monarchy. We have the implosion of the czars. We have the loss of the Belgian monarchies. We have the Spanish monarchy is going to fall apart a little bit later. But you have this is a shift in the entire perspective of global history taking place at the centerpiece of where Christianity is meant to be doing its thing. And in the place of that, we have the rise and the rather sudden and quick fall of fascism / communism / Soviet-style communism. And these things are all happening very, very quickly. At the same time, there are 3 separate gigantic heresies that arise all at roughly the same time, and all of which are still alive and well right now in the church. The broad category of these heresies is called modernism, and it arises in the late 1800s, and it's ultimately led by, guess what, the Jesuits. Who are the lead modernist heretics of the modern world. And there's a cat named Teilhard de Chardin, who kind of sums up all of this heresy and brings it forward. And the reason that this matters is that into this mess, of this heretical mess that's happening, in 1910, Pope St. Pius X says, look, the problem we have with the entire heresy problem, the problem we have with the heresy of Protestantism, the problem we have with the Freemasons, the problem we have with modernism as a heresy is not spiritual, it's not theological, it's philosophical. Now, we won't go off on the tangent. I did 2 thesis papers on this, but the short version is that humanity in the modern world lost touch with what it means to be a human person. And this goes back a ways, but the short version is quite simply, we have become detached from what it means to be a human person. Even nowadays, we're seeing the result of that, where you say, all that really matters is what I identify as being, right? I mean, all of this kind of trans nonsense is ultimately just the completion, the final result of the product of we don't know who we are. We don't know our sense of self-identity. And that all really goes back to the modern project, but ultimately it goes back to this modern heresy. And so in 1910, Pius X explains this in a couple of complicated documents, and he is basically setting up and saying, if we want to get the world back together, what we need to do is get our philosophy in order. He says this 10 years before John Paul II is born. In the same kind of cultural milieu, John Paul II is born into the rise and the establishment of divine mercy. We talked about this last month with Sister Faustina. And so John Paul II is coming up in a culture that has got the kind of the last bits of the Nazis on one side, the rise of Soviet communism on the other. He's got one of the most incredible and brilliant cardinals, Cardinal Stephen, Polish name, who is going to be his kind of personal mentor, who is neck deep in the understanding of the damage the Jesuits are doing and the damage of Teilhard de Chardin in particular. And John Paul II is this once-in-a-generation intellect, and he's bringing that all together under the envelope and the umbrella of divine mercy. So that's as simple as I can possibly make why this is so important, where John Paul II brings all of this together and why he devotes the entirety of his life to being a philosopher of all things. Now, once he becomes a bishop, he doesn't stop being a philosopher. He writes the most complicated philosophy book I've ever touched. In fact, we brought in this guy for our priest retreat recently, and he and I were talking about it, and we were arguing about whether anybody has ever really finished the book that Pope John Paul II wrote. In Polish, the book has the name Person and Act. In English, it's translated as the acting person. It doesn't matter. It's incomprehensible. But what Pope John Paul II is doing in this 1,000 or so pages is trying to explain to us what has gone wrong with our sense of understanding what it means to be a human person and what it means to act in such a way that is genuinely human. And you could just imagine how complicated that would be to explain. But that's ultimately the great project of his youth. And then once he inexplicably is brought forward into the cardinalate, which was totally unexpected by everybody, he shows up in Rome and gets permission to go to Rome for the election in 1978 of what will go on to become Pope John Paul I. Now, I don't know if y'all know the somewhat laughing, somewhat not laughing conspiracy theories associated with Pope John Paul I. He was Pope for 33 days. He very loudly, very publicly said at the end of the conclave that elected him in 1978, "It is my first and primary intention as Pope to suppress the Jesuit order." And 33 days later, he dies suddenly, unexpectedly, and under extremely shady circumstances. So there's some conspiracy theory stuff here. If you want to put your tinfoil hat on, you can have some fun with it. I'm not looking to get into that debate. There's some back and forth there. Maybe it was the aliens that did it. I don't know. But anyway, it was sudden. It was unexpected. And in that first conclave in early 1978, nobody was thinking that Karol Wojtyła, the Archbishop of Warsaw in communist Poland, was a good choice for Pope. Well, when John Paul I suddenly and inexplicably dies, they go back and everybody is going, maybe we should think about this a little differently. The folks pray, and then suddenly and inexplicably, the communist Archbishop of Warsaw, Poland, at the height of the Cold War in 1978, people look and say, this is our man to be the Pope. And suddenly and inexplicably, in fact, it was so inexplicable that the news agencies in the United States famously didn't even have a picture of him. They had nothing. They didn't have any idea who this guy was, and it took several days before pictures of Karol Wojtyła, now Pope John Paul II, were even put on Western televisions because nobody could get a photograph of the guy because he was so off of everyone's radar. What continues to be amazing and important about his legacy is that when John Paul II is finally in office, he writes his first encyclical. And the first encyclical is famous for every pope because this is the one where he basically sets forward his program. What does he want to accomplish? John Paul I never even got around to writing it because he was only in office for 30 days. John Paul II's first document is called Redemptor Hominis. It's remarkably, mystically readable. It's actually comprehensible. And in that document, he sets out this great project where he says, look, we have lost touch with what it means to be human beings. And that means that we can't get in touch with Jesus Christ because Jesus Christ and he alone reveals us to ourselves. And so we have got to pay attention to Jesus if we want to get a sense of who we are and what our purpose in this life is. And you can see how that's right in line with the broader project that Pope John Paul II had when he was a younger man, and right in line with what he was trying to accomplish. And in fact, that quotation, Jesus Christ and he alone reveals man to himself, comes directly from the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, chapter 22, which John Paul II wrote as the primary secretary for the committee that wrote Gaudium et Spes, a document that was very, very close to John Paul II's own heart. And so you have this great philosophical project. And in fact, he was Pope long enough where he was able to write philosophy documents, much, much more than theology documents, on basically every topic in the church. He wrote philosophy documents on mission. He wrote philosophy documents on what it means to do theology, philosophy documents on spirituality. And basically all the documents that he wrote, his huge body of work, is all philosophy. It's one of the reasons it's more difficult to read John Paul II than it is to read other popes, but it's also the reason that his works will continue to be studied. The great controversial reality we're facing right now is that theologians and priests are looking at Vatican II and saying, we can throw this out. That it's had its day. It's gone. That's the big part of the reason that Pope Francis has kind of made this huge show of saying you've got to stand by Vatican II, but it's being artificially propped up. Professionals are not using it anymore. Seminaries are moving aside because it's done what it's going to do. It was a pastoral document that was written for a specific moment in history, and really and truly, it was treated like the Reichstag fire from the beginning. The spirit of Vatican II is constantly referenced, even by Pope Francis, but nobody's reading the actual documents anymore. And in fact, when those documents are referenced, you even have major cardinals going, that's irrelevant, it doesn't matter. And in fact, in 3 separate talks recently, Pope Francis said the text of the council doesn't mean anything. All that matters is the spirit of it. And so in many ways, Vatican II is done. We've reached the point where those documents are no longer being considered relevant, even by the Holy Father himself. And so we're looking now around for what's going to be the next theological foundation. For better or worse, Pope Francis' writing is not holding up in that regard just because it's not been well received. Pope Benedict's writings are not being held up all that well in that regard because he only wrote 3 documents of any kind of consequence. He was only pope for a few years, and besides writing these big, complicated theological documents on Jesus of Nazareth, Pope Benedict doesn't really have a great deal of work to draw from in terms of what's the next big thing. But John Paul II's work is what now people are turning to and saying, what do we do to understand missions nowadays? Pope Francis, because he has a bad habit of saying things that don't always line up, is not getting a great deal of reading. But when you look at these important seminaries and these important theological works, people are now going back to John Paul II, something which was predicted by a lot of writers in his own time, because for whatever reason, philosophy is the underlying need of the church right now. And so I don't say this because any of us here are professional theologians, certainly myself included, but to say and to understand that what John Paul II turned out was not merely a bunch of spiritual writing. It was not merely a bunch of sermons that were fascinating or interesting and that applied to one moment in history. John Paul II very deliberately was writing a body of philosophy to reestablish and reground our entire modern world in a Christian humanism. The other reason I really want to bring that forward and make it clear is I've had a number of folks come to me in the course of the last, say, 20 years of being a priest who go, John Paul II is unreadable. I mean, unreadable. And I go, that's okay. That's completely all right, because there are a number of things that he wrote where he's not trying to write something for everybody, right? There's a particular document he wrote in 1996 called Fides et Ratio, where he's trying to explain the way that faith and reason are meant to work together and to help us to understand what it means to be Christian. That's not a document for everybody. That's a philosophical treatise on epistemology, right? So that's okay if we don't comprehend it. But John Paul II remains an incredibly important figure, even if everything he wrote is not for everybody. And so that said, if you're interested in reading John Paul II, I can recommend a couple of categories of documents that are relatively readable. And if you kind of dig into it and you say, gosh, this is actually pretty interesting. So you can find all of his writings on the Vatican's website, www.vatican.va, and you can go to the popes and you go to John Paul II. His encyclicals, his encyclicals, which is a word that means letters, are generally written for everybody. The encyclicals, I believe there are 16 of them, were really written for the whole world, although some of them, including Fides et Ratio, are difficult to read. His apostolic exhortations are very consciously written for everybody. Those followed on from big synodal meetings, and so he has things in there about what you need to do to talk for the church in Oceania or for the church in the Americas. He's got documents among those, Duc in Altum, which is a document about how we can be evangelists in the world and things like that. Those are wonderful. The other thing that's worth reading from him are the book-length interviews. He's got books, there are at least 6 of them, and I'm struggling to remember right now the one that I really wanted to recommend, but he's got a series of book-length interviews that are really, really excellent and easy to read because it's just John Paul explaining something. The one that is the best, gosh, I can't remember the name of it, where he actually explains what happened when he was shot on the feast of Our Lady of Fatima in 1981, 3 years into his papacy. And he talks about some of the crazy stuff because it's not tin hat conspiracy theory when we say that John Paul was shot by a Turkish man who tried to kill him, but then that there were a series of incredibly sketchy things that happened, including his usual ambulance crew not being there inexplicably, and then him being given tainted blood and being taken not to the hospital right down the road, but to the hospital all the way across Rome. So much so that even at the time, people were fairly sure that the ambulance crew was trying to kill him. And he actually got Parkinson's disease from this tainted blood that was given to him, despite the fact that they banked a lot of his own blood at the hospital right down the road. He went all the way to the other part of Rome and was given blood that was tainted with Parkinson's disease. And it was just the crazy events in his life are beyond imagination. But the book-length interviews get into some of those details. So to provide a bit of a recap, John Paul II was a once-in-a-lifetime kind of character. He spoke 16 languages. He was brilliant at everything he did. He was a talented athlete, talented musician, talented poet, talented artist, talented everything. He grew up in an incredibly complex and at the same time truly universal kind of environment that brought together the chaos of a generation, the complete collapse of the European monarchy system, as well as the incredible spiritual blessing and time of Marian apparitions at La Salette and Lourdes and Fatima, and at the same time divine mercy, and at the same time all of these great questions of the modern world. He took all of these different things and became one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, and then he identified and recognized that the great struggle we're having in the church right now is a struggle of philosophy. He wrote a mountain of documents specifically addressed to that, and did so at a time that is incredibly important for us to recognize the need and value of those documents. Some of them are very difficult to read. They are not universally addressed to ordinary folks, but they are incredibly important. And even as we speak now, we are starting to see that those documents are becoming the more and more important for professional theologians and clergy, because the Second Vatican Council itself, as well as a number of other writers that surround it, are starting to lose a great deal of interest, because those documents have been, you know, what is there to take has been taken, what is there to absorb has been absorbed. And so we're looking now at people, at these professional theologians looking around and saying, what can we use to address the problems of our modern world? And it turns out that Pope St. John Paul II was deeply prophetic in his understanding, not just of the answers and solutions, but the nature of the problems themselves. That doesn't always mean that it's going to be more interesting for us to read him, but it does, I think, help us to understand some of the underlying issues that make Pope St. John Paul II so incredibly important, and at least helps us to have a sense of context as to why he continues to be relevant even some almost 20 years now after he has died. And so that is a very complicated, deeply just complicated or complex kind of web of ideas summed down into as a very, very brief as I possibly can. I have been Father Ryan Humphries. This has been the CU Catecast. I hope it's been helpful, and we'll hopefully see you again very soon.